Before there was a United States, there was a civilization. Hundreds of them, actually. And by the time the men we call founding fathers put quill to parchment and declared that all men are created equal, those civilizations had already been systematically dismantled by disease, by war, and by deliberate policy. This is the story they don't put on the dollar bill. If you want history told straight, no myths, no propaganda, subscribe right now. New videos every week. The Americas were not empty when Europeans arrived. Archaeological evidence and genetic studies confirm that humans first crossed into North America from Siberia via the Bering Land Bridge approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago during the last ice age. By the time Columbus made contact in 1492, an estimated 50 to 60 million people lived across North and South America, a figure supported by historian Charles Mann in his landmark work, 1491. North America alone held between 2 and 18 million people, organized into hundreds of distinct nations, each with its own language, governance, economy, and culture. These were not primitive wanderers. The Mississippian city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had a population of around 10,000 to 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 AD, larger than London at the same time. The ancestral Puebloans built multi-story stone cities into cliffsides in the southwest. The Haudenosaunee, known as the Iroquois Confederacy, had formed a sophisticated democratic alliance of 5, later 6, nations, with a constitution called the Great Law of Peace. Historians and political scientists, including scholar Donald Grind, have documented that Benjamin Franklin studied this confederacy extensively and referenced it when calling for colonial unity in 1754 at the Albany Congress. The founders of the United States were, in part, students of indigenous political philosophy. Then came 1492. Within decades of first European contact, indigenous populations collapsed catastrophically. The primary killer was not warfare, it was disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and influenza swept through communities that had never been exposed to these pathogens and had zero immunity. Historian David Stannard, in American Holocaust, estimates that up to 90% of the pre-contact indigenous population died within 150 years of European arrival. In some regions, entire nations were wiped out before Europeans even set foot there, as disease traveled faster than explorers. This demographic collapse was so total that when English settlers arrived at Plymouth in 1620, they found fields already cleared, villages already built, and largely empty. The land wasn't wilderness. It was a post-plague landscape. Squanto, the Patuxent man who helped the Pilgrims survive their first winter, had learned English after being kidnapped by an English explorer in 1614. He returned to his homeland in 1619 to find his entire village dead from disease. He helped the colonists anyway. As English colonies expanded through the 1600s and early 1700s, conflict with indigenous nations intensified. King Philip's War, fought from 1675 to 1676 in New England, was proportionally one of the deadliest wars in American history. The Wampanoag leader Metacom, called King Philip by the colonists, led a coalition against English expansion. The war ended with his death, his wife and son sold into slavery in the Caribbean, and thousands of native people killed or enslaved. By the mid-1700s, tensions between Britain and its colonies were building. Indigenous nations were caught in the middle of a geopolitical chess match they had not asked to play. During the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763, many native nations allied with the French, seeing them as the lesser threat to their lands. Britain won. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 then drew a line along the Appalachian Mountains and told colonists they could not settle west of it, partly to prevent further conflict with native nations. The colonists were furious. This proclamation became one of the grievances that pushed them toward revolution. Think about that. One of the reasons the Founding Fathers wanted independence from Britain was that Britain was trying to stop them from taking native land. The Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776, contains a line that is rarely discussed in schools. In listing grievances against King George III, Jefferson wrote that the king had endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. This is verbatim from the original document. The men who declared universal human equality in the same document explicitly described indigenous people as savages in the same breath. George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army and first president, ordered the Sullivan-Clinton Campaign in 1779, a military operation specifically designed to destroy Haudenosaunee towns and crops. He instructed General John Sullivan to lay waste to their settlements so completely that they could not be rebuilt. Washington referred to Native Americans in private correspondence as wolves, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. The Haudenosaunee later gave Washington the name Town Destroyer, a name that persists in oral history to this day. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the soaring language of the Declaration, held a more complicated and ultimately darker position on indigenous people. He publicly advocated for assimilation, that native nations should adopt European farming practices and abandon their cultures. But in private letters to William Henry Harrison in 1803, Jefferson outlined a strategy of encouraging native nations to go into debt with government trading posts, so that when debt became unmanageable, they would be forced to cede land to pay it off. He wrote this explicitly. It was policy. If this is hitting different from what you learned in school, that means it's doing its job. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this history. Not everyone accepted dispossession quietly. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, spent years in the early 1800s traveling across the continent building a pan-indigenous confederacy to resist American expansion, one of the most ambitious political projects in North American history. He allied with the British during the War of 1812 and died in battle in 1813. His dream of a unified indigenous resistance died with him. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Andrew Jackson, formalized what had been happening through violence and attrition for decades. It authorized the forced relocation of Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations from their southeastern homelands to territory west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee removal, known as the Trail of Tears, killed an estimated 4,000 of the 16,000 people forced to march. The Supreme Court had actually ruled in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. Jackson ignored the ruling. He simply refused to enforce it. By the end of the 19th century, indigenous land holdings in the United States had been reduced from the entire continent to approximately 138 million acres. And following the Dawes Act of 1887, which divided communal tribal lands into individual allotments to encourage assimilation, that figure dropped further to around 48 million acres by the 1930s. The United States was not built on empty land. It was built on the lands of people who had governed, farmed, traded, and created sophisticated societies for millennia. The Founding Fathers were brilliant, complex, flawed men who articulated ideals of freedom and equality that they knew, in many cases, they were not applying universally. The country they built was shaped as much by what they took as by what they created. Understanding this does not erase the genuine achievements of American democracy. It makes them more honest. A nation that can look clearly at its full history, not just its monuments, is a nation capable of something real. That is the story of America's founding, told in full. The founders, the first peoples, the disease, the wars, the broken treaties, and the land. History is complicated. That is exactly why it matters. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because there is a lot more history left to unpack.